afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and dear audience. I welcome you on behalf of Conflict and Resilience Research Institute Canada's latest episode, number 7. Today's episode is composed of Peace and Conflict Studies alumni and the program director. And the title of our today's webinar is Impact of COVID-19 on Peacebuilding, Higher Education, and Conflict. This webinar is particularly important for me because I also studied in the same center and graduated in 2017. Before we start our webinar, as a part of tradition, we want to acknowledge that Conflict and Resilience Research Institute Canada is located on original lands of Anishinaabe Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Ladies and gentlemen, we have esteemed panelists with us today, and let me introduce them now. Our first panelist today is Dr. Adam Mueller, and he's a professor at University of Manitoba and the director of Peace and Conflict Studies graduate programs. And Dr. Mueller is the director, as I said, of the program, and he's also the former acting director of the Interdisciplinary Master of Human Rights program at University of Manitoba. He researches and teaches on the visual representation of genocide, suffering, and human rights. Dr. Mueller is going to talk on COVID-19 and community. Our next speaker is Dr. Catherine Standish, and she is the Director of Research at the National Center for Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Otago in Aotearoa, New Zealand. He is a peace scholar, practitioner working towards violence transformation in education and the self. She is the author of Suicide Through a Peacebuilding Lens, Yogic Peace Education and Cultural Violence in the Classroom. And Dr. Katerina Standish is going to talk today on personal peace building in a pandemic. Our next panelist today is Dr. Laura E. Reimer, and she is an MPA PhD, and she brings 4 perspectives on higher education to the COVID-19 discussion. She is an alumni of the University of Manitoba, where she currently serves as a member of the Board of Governors, conducts research into the impacts of public policy on people, serves in an administrative capacity for Canada's only Masters of Human Rights program, and teaches in a non-tenured role. The author of lead editor of 6 books on conflict resolution and positive organizational change, Dr. Reimer brings an informed, broad, yet personal perspective to the multidimensional impact of COVID-19 experienced in one large Canadian university. And her today's title is Canadian University and Pandemic, One Woman, 4 Perspectives. And we also have Dr. Evelyn Mayanja, and she will be possibly joining us a little later, and she's the instructor at the University of Winnipeg. So without further ado, let's join with the esteemed panelists today. And the way we conduct, we allow the panelists to speak for uninterrupted 15 minutes or so. And then we get and receive questions from the audience, those who have joined in our many of the platforms. And we show the questions, flash the questions on your screen. You can read the question and answer as you like. So let's, without further ado, let's continue our discussion. And our first panelist is Dr. Adam Mueller. Floor is yours, sir.
So thank you very much, Katerina, especially alongside such interesting interlocutors. I'm really privileged to be here today talking with all of you and alongside all of you about COVID-19, about the virus crisis, and particularly about what, in very general terms, I'm thinking about in relation to the issue of community and the effects that the virus has had on community. I will prepare some remarks. So I'm going to be reading a little bit, but mostly just to manage time. So if I have to stop, I can stop and just pick things up when we have a more open Q&A. But I thought I might begin just by simply saying that it's probably obvious that the lockdown that we've experienced recently in response to the global pandemic has changed the way the ways that we live and interact with one another. I think this change is detectable at almost every level of our lives, most conspicuously perhaps for those of us living in the modern and developed West. And I think what we're experiencing actually continues a longer standing process that is consisting of the blurring of the line between our public and our private lives. So as we've sort of entered into the lockdown, I think it's become more and more impossible for those of us, for example, working full-time at home, alongside perhaps educating young children, maintaining our hobbies, our social obligations, our activist commitments, and so forth. It's impossible for us to create clear boundaries between not just around the different tasks that we're trying to undertake, but also in the different ways that we're trying to undertake it. And I think, I'm calling this a part of a blurring and a more general blurring that has been underway since at least the early 2000s that involves the erasure of the kind of definiteness of the boundary between the public and the private. We've seen this erasure fueled in part by the advent of new technologies. And these technologies have in turn given rise to new forms of social interaction that are relatively indifferent to what we might think of as old school privacy norms. So we see, for example, in the rise of selfie culture, the rise of commercially sponsored influencers who let people into their private lives in order to market products, the further blurring of the line between what we can sort of conduct in terms of our private lives and, say, commerce or the world out there. So the inside and the outside are becoming blurred. My claim is that under the lockdown, this blurring has actually intensified and accelerated somewhat. Particularly, as I say, and you need to not overgeneralize, but I think particularly for those of us sort of resident within and working within the modern industrialized West. I think there's also, in relation to, in conjunction with this this blurring of boundaries, there's been a corresponding shift in the way we go about prioritizing certain of our values. Okay, so it's not just a shift in this boundary, but it's a shift in the values that this boundary, in fact, itself supports. And I think, it's fair to say that in some respects we've become more open and available to one another. But as we've done so, we've had to rethink what values we privilege in our social interactions with one another so that we can determine more accurately, reliably, which of our values are more likely to support behaviors that are productive, or at least that do the least harm. And I think, what we see happening in the kind of broader context as a consequence of the emergence of the cyber culture is a move to reject certain kinds of judgments on individuals' physical identities, right? So we have now a kind of emerging counter discourse on body shaming that has helped to sort of redirect our moral and political priorities away from a kind of indictment of other people because of how they look and towards more constructive modes of engagement with people about health and other things. I think we also see the rise of new legislation, which is intended to protect those subjected to cyber stalking, for example, and online sexual harassment, for example, all of which sort of marks, again, a kind of positive consequence to this reshaping of our value matrix. Although, as I say, what's more important to me rather than the specifics now is to acknowledge that whatever kind of changes are connected to the eradication of the boundary between the public and the private, at least some of those changes have a normative component to them. At least some of them are sort of wedded to the way in which we give moral priority to certain things. And I say perhaps as a sort of another symptom, a more conspicuous symptom of this values reprioritization, I would point to the Me Too movement and, of course, Black Lives Matters, which has assumed a kind of global significance that has in fact been marked by demand that we collectively reshape our values, along non-racist lines, non-sexist lines. But this has also itself been shaped by digital culture and the kinds of intimacies, and new correspondences that are made possible through these new modes of interaction. But I think, for me, as a theorist, working as a theorist, the question remains, right? Why, and the question is, why do we need the public and private split anyway? I mean, if the tendency that we're inhabiting is now towards the eradication of this boundary, then why should we be inclined to care, right? To preserve it? Like, why does it matter? Why might it matter? And I think it matters for many reasons that we shouldn't lose sight of, notwithstanding the force majeure that we're sort of confronted with at the moment. So it matters. Privacy matters, right? It matters partly because I think it affords a number of protections to matters of conscience. So we need privacy, in other words, in order to be able to have a safe space available to us within which we can think as well as speak truth to power, right? Without privacy, we can be policed in that very intimate way, and that prevents us from thinking freely. And I think and this is more related to my topic, I think the public-private split also helps us to mark the limits of community. I think it does so in a couple different ways. We can talk more about the technicalities later, but I think the public part of publicity, when we think about, what it means to live in public life, we can define this differently. We can define this thickly, we can define it thinly. But I think it can serve at least as a marker of in-group solidarity. And so it allows us to, via the idea of how we cash out the term public, we can distinguish between what binds us together collectively and who we are individually, because who we are collectively is the public side of us, and who we are personally is the private side of us. So we need kind of that. But I think it also, publicity allows us to draw a line between different groups, right? So one public is not the same as another public, is not the same as another public, and so forth. So insofar as we have investments in the categories of the public and the private, I think these investments can play out in a number of different registers and in a number of different fields: normative fields, political fields, social fields, anthropological fields, and so forth. So look, what am I trying to say? I'm trying to suggest that insofar as the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has further altered aspects of our understanding of the nature of privacy, and so by extension our kind of felt sense of who we are as individuals and where our individuality begins and ends, I think we have also, and this is the argument I want to make, the more polemical part of the point I want to make, I think we've also become implicated in a major shift. I think what the cultural anthropologist Victor Turner has described as a shift from community to communitas. Okay, so communitas is the Latin term that Turner is drawing on, and I'm going through a kind of Victor Turner renaissance at the moment. For the last year and a bit, I've been sort of going back to liminality, community, sort of thinking through partly liminality. I'm going to talk a bit more about the liminal, but these liminal situations that we can find ourselves in, situations that on the one hand are filled with possibility and at the same time filled with tremendous risk. So I've been interested in the double-edgedness of liminality, and of course with Turner you can't talk about liminality without also talking about community. So for Turner, communitas is the preferred term he uses to designate belonging during a time of liminality. So we experience and are implicated in communitas when we inhabit a liminal moment. And the liminal moments are moments when gaps form between the structures comprising our regular social and institutional lives or roles, right? When we don't have seamlessness, when we don't have continuity, when we have this disruption, a disjunction, and aparias, which is the kind of postmodern term for these moments of epistemic crisis or undecidability, where we can't really call things one way or another, where we're uncertain. So it's within these kind of liminal states. Often for Turner, of course, these states arise in moments, in rites of passage, during rites of passage. As we move, say, from childhood to adulthood, we enter the liminal when we're neither one thing nor the other. I mean, the term that Turner uses for it, literally, and I'm quoting, is betwixt and between. When we're betwixt and between, we are in the liminal. And when we're in the liminal, we can't inhabit a community in the ordinary sense, precisely because what marks liminal spaces and times is the deep contingency of everything and the unstructuredness of everything. And of course, community in the more conventional sense is a concept deeply invested in the idea of structure and structuration, right? Like, because we inhabit a community when certain kind of patterns of shared and overlapping behavior accrete to such an extent that they become not just recognized, but recognized as recognized. And through that secondary effect, we sort of begin to create pathways for the kind of effective channels that pull us into a correspondence with other people that we think of as the phenomenology of community. So, so the point is that within liminal spaces, we experience communitas. And communitas is distinguishable from community in virtue of the emphasis of community on structure, right? For Turner, community expresses the bond between people arising from the fact of their sharing either a physical territory of some kind or resources or values of interest. So there's a kind of spatial or physical or ideological correspondence for community for Turner. Now, this is consistent with the OED's definition of community as a body of people who live in the same place, usually sharing a common cultural or ethnic identity, hence a place where a particular body of people lives, right? So there's something very bounded about that, very materializable in that of course we can't really bring into the domain of the liminal because of its inherent contingencies. So communitas, in contrast with community, is for Turner, and I'll quote Turner, an unstructured state in which all members are equal, allowing them to share a common experience, usually through a rite of passage. Right? So, I mean, obviously what I'm going to be saying here is that what we're involved in right at this moment is a rite of passage, that we're in a transition between whatever was before the virus and whatever's coming after the virus. And in this moment, what we're experiencing, partly in a way that's being mediated by technology, in ways that have antecedents back to the late 1990s or earlier, but what we're experiencing is communitas, and the experience of communitas, which is an experience of belonging rather than an experience of sharing space, sharing property, sharing values, and so forth. And what this means is that the possibilities for reinventing, redescribing, and reimagining our values, imagining our structures, are limitless at this moment in time. Now, I'm going to also sort of argue, and I'm sort of sensitive to the fact that I'm running on. I don't want to dominate or take too much time up, but I think, if I could summarize where I'm going with all of this, which is very fuzzy still for me and not altogether precise, but I want to say that, basically three things. One, COVID-19 has disrupted the flow of ordinary life, rendering life as most of us know how to live it more liminal than ever before. Now, since the liminal exists betwixt and between structures and arises as we move away from one mode of being in the world to another, there are, during this liminal moments, and this is my second point, that there is during this liminal moment a movement from community to communitas. Now, I think along the way that we've become able to reimagine and rethink who and what we are in relation to others, in large and small ways, and I'd point to BLM as well as a kind of example of this, as an example of the possibility resident within this moment. And I think, thirdly, I want to say that the virus pandemic and its related lockdown have made it possible for some people, for perhaps the very first time, to reimagine the world and our respective places in it in ways unencumbered by earlier and deeply entrenched and hierarchizing biases, predispositions, and fears. That's the important signal feature of the horizontality of the communitas, right? It frees us from indebtedness to prior modes of hierarchizing everything: values, races, modes of life, geographical locations. We're not in that space when we're in communitas because we're operating in a moment in a milieu of undifferentiated horizontality, not verticality at all. So what does this mean really? And again, I'm speaking as a theorist now. I think there are practical consequences. Obviously, I was hoping to sort of address those more in conversation. But I think finally, I want to say two things. One, the liminal sites, or states rather, are sites of extraordinary precarity and risk, and they're therefore danger zones. So liminal personae And if you think about refugees or migrants, and Hannah Arendt obviously knew this very, very well, when you're caught betwixt and between identities or social categories or communities and legal regimes, when you're not one kind of being in the world or another, then it's very difficult to recognize you, at least in the moral sense that Charles Taylor means it when he talks about the politics of recognition. If you're not any one thing, if you don't belong to a category that we can appeal to make sense of you, then you aren't really there in a way that we can make sense of. Now, on the one hand, there's a positive to this because you're exempted from the kind of dominating gaze of the other. On the other hand, though, you can't be afforded the kinds of protections that go along with belonging to a certain group, which we've already agreed requires a certain kind of protection. So you can't be helped and this is why somebody like Hannah Arendt felt that stateless people needed a national identity, needed a form of state belonging in order to be actually protected. That absent those state protections, they couldn't be rendered visible enough to be guaranteed not just the human rights that we all take for granted, but the right to have rights, which is something that seems to be something assignable only through citizenship, right? We need citizenship in order to make that happen. But I would say that, like, within all this vulnerability, and this is my final thing to say, is that the news isn't all bad. I mean, I think in addition to precariousness and vulnerability, those who inhabit these threshold states or margin states, these liminal states, and so people who inhabit a communitas, right? They're endowed with extraordinary range of possibilities, most profoundly possibilities of becoming. This is, I think, precisely because that the liminal beings are difficult to recognize. So they can assert whatever form of identity they wish and reimagine new forms of identity we haven't had time to conceive yet. Because again, in the liminal state, you're not indebted to the past in any concrete way. But of course, this indeterminacy and fluidity can be unsettling both to those who are liminal and to those witnessing the liminality of others. And so there's a need to negotiate and discuss and describe and redescribe and remain actively involved with the others so that we can, just become more aware of what their indeterminacy signifies. But I think precisely because this indeterminacy, as I said before, what was formerly unthinkable becomes possible. And I think within that, we see the seeds of the kind of most, I think, extremely positive response that or optimistic reaction we've had to the Black Lives Matter protests that have had happening globally, where people are actually saying, no, this is a watershed moment and the world will be different afterwards. I think what underwrites that view, that feeling, is precisely our embeddedness in this liminal moment that has been brought around by the COVID-19 lockdown. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mueller, for a very insightful piece of discussion. And in the meantime, let me welcome Dr. Evelyn Mayanja for joining our group and discussion today. And because I couldn't introduce her, let me read through her short bio. So Dr. Evelyn Mannie is a scholar and educator on wars, peace and development. Currently a sessional instructor at the University of Winnipeg, and her doctoral dissertation titled People's Experiences and Perceptions of War and Peace in South Kivu, Eastern DR Congo. And she received the University of Manitoba Distinguished Dissertation Award. Evelyn has not only studied but has lived through war in Africa's Great Lakes region. Her research focuses on how indigenous wisdom can contribute on peacekeeping and ecological protection in Congo. Evelyn attributes her passion for peace and development to her mother. Welcome, Evelyn. Thank you very much for joining us. So we'll move to our second panelist today, Dr. Catherine Standish, and the floor is yours, ma'am.
Hello, everybody. I'd like to begin also by acknowledging that we're being hosted for this webinar in Treaty 1 territory. But I'd also like to acknowledge my fellow speakers, Dr. Mueller, Dr. Reimer, Dr. Mayanja, and of course, Dr. Ahmed, for facilitating this platform of engagement today, and the Conflict and Resilience Research Institute of Canada for hosting us all. So thank you. I'm Katerina Standish of the National Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies. And today I'd like to offer a consideration and a construct for peace building during the COVID-19 pandemic. So in our field, peace and conflict studies, peacebuilding is defined as an intervention that recognizes, minimizes, removes, and prevents violence. Most well-known incarnations of peacebuilding involve group interventions or interventions into groups. For example, interethnic peacebuilding, interreligious peacebuilding, coexistence peacebuilding, and various deliberate techniques, which often include conflict resolution management or transformation. Peacebuilding, of course, is comprised of interactions of people that aim to address violence and injustice, but it's built on a fundamental human bridging, binding, and bonding technology, the relationship. In order to peace build, it requires association, connection, and a collective dynamic, because despite cultural individualism, humans not only need one another to be human, we neither come into this world alone nor live that way. Any connection to authentic self, community, spirit, and ecology are necessary to live without hurting nature, hurting others, or hurting ourselves. Personal peacebuilding is an intervention that transforms conflict and prevents violence in the self, to the self, and by the self. How personal peacebuilding differs from many established forms of group peacebuilding, and in fact, I think offers a potential, is that the fundamental vehicle for transformation, the relationship, in personal peacebuilding, emerges from a relationship with the self. This form of peacebuilding has internal and external facets related to disposition, culture, mindsets and behavior, as well as identity, community, and the environment. But in both these domains, the purpose of personal peacebuilding remains constant. Recognize conflict, encounter conflict without violence, and manifest nonviolent and life-nourishing behavior in community with other people and nature. Which brings us to the pandemic. So the Council on Foreign Relations wrote on May 21st that the novel coronavirus has infected millions, killed hundreds of thousands, and affected the well-being of billions more. The COVID-19 pandemic is a transnational threat that requires a global response. But the outbreak has laid bare divergent national approaches to managing global epidemiological interdependence and exposed broader structural weaknesses in the global governance system. Nationalist and inward-looking policies could lead to the loss of millions of lives and a global economic disaster. So in a global pandemic, many possibilities are present. In some cases, a stable country with good public health, political stability, and resources like New Zealand, where I am, they'll be able to address the threat of the virus, even if the public health response temporarily weakens other societal stabilizers, such as employment and education. In states with health and wealth inequality, insecurity will rise, creating more uncertainty, more violence, and a greater inability to reach equilibrium. In fragile states, the pandemic will continue to destabilize communities, but also potentially trigger outbreaks that increase risk of transmission, such as the riots in the United States in protest against police brutality, endemic underservice and support for communities of color, and the morality vacuum in government. In this way, the pandemic both creates human suffering related to health, wealth, and well-being, but also exacerbates and perpetuates underlying and potential instability. But let's be clear, the global experts are saying there'll be no return to normal. And for too many, normal was not nonviolent and not life-sustaining, which means a return to normal isn't good enough. Quarantine, self-isolation, social distancing, PPE, they're now as familiar to our ears as the sound of traffic whizzing by. As Assistant Professor Aisha Ahmad at the University of Toronto has written, we are now feeling disaster in our bones. And the answer to the question, when will we all return to normal, genuinely, is never. The result of this pandemic can be appreciated as a global calamity to which the history books will align. Similar to pre-9/11 and post, there's a new ripple in the timeline, pre-COVID, and inevitably, whatever comes afterwards. What we're all going to have to face as cultures, nations, communities, and individuals is that we're witnessing an eradication of an old global order in living history, yet stuck in an indefinite present where future plans are postponed, canceled, and unimagined. We are surrounded by information with a perception of the scope of this calamity that extends far further than any other generation of knowledge contained. Our screens and the algorithms are creating realities for us that have permitted us to connect from our quarantines, yes, but also to increasingly understand ourselves as public health pawns on a global chessboard. We get to see and compare ourselves to other nations, territories, cities, and various indicators leave us with symbolic suffering, indefinable shame, arrogant satisfaction, and intolerant prejudice. This pandemic has taken us out of our communities of affiliation and interest, online and in real life, into a desperate digital need to consume and attempt to digest information that has great impact and echo in our humanity. Some of that data is hopeful and inspiring. Much of it is perilous, false, and is leading us to further upheaval and maybe tragedy. For every Twitter post declaring someone has beaten coronavirus, there's a YouTube video claiming coronavirus is a hoax. Conspiracy theorists ran to media spaces that it's a plot to destabilize Western supremacy, and actual adult humans deliberately spit on frontline service staff or demand employees work despite and without ignorance of the mortal risks. The line between good and bad information has never been so blurred, and its result will reverberate for decades. At the point this pandemic hit, we were living in what philosopher Ziggy Bauman called the liquid modern, a state of social and global precarity, an interregnum, liminality, a place between what was and what's yet to be. Or to paraphrase Dr. Sarah Kendzior, a time where we don't get to dream of the future, but rather meet circumstances, endless trials and spectacles that direct our attention and resources as we simply just try and survive. And many of us won't. Globally, COVID-19 has taken a disproportionate toll on communities of color, the elderly, Indigenous groups, vulnerable people, and frontline essential workers who risk survival to address the impact of the virus. There are increases in hate crimes and harassment, and racism and sexism are amplified with every Asian person blamed for the Chinese virus and undocumented single mothers forced to serve customers at risk. With every person who can't afford the luxury and privilege of social distancing or the ability to persevere when their livelihoods or income generations for others has ceased. The virus has permitted millions of financially stable individuals and companies to furlough the humanity and dignity of their employees as benefits from governments get pocketed by nefarious criminals. These are just some of the outcomes. There are millions of others. So here's life in lockdown. Inequality will increase. Past pandemics, such as the Spanish flu, SARS, H1N1, MERS, Ebola, and Zika virus, mainly impacted low-skilled or unskilled workers and their families. It will raise income disparity and redirect income to the already wealthy. Today, in a world of rampant inequality, the scales are about to tip even further towards those without need. This is illustrated by campaigns of wash your hands, which clearly are not options for communities without access to advantages of heated and safe homes with clean water and sanitation. And it was recently reported that by May, US billionaires had already profited during the pandemic to the tune of $565 billion. But let's turn to some specific topics. Domestic violence. While stemming community transmission, lockdown increases risk and incidences of domestic violence. Unemployment, financial uncertainty, stress, anxiety, and the inability for people to leave violent spaces has led, in many countries, to a second epidemic of domestic violence. Despite the word, bubbles are not safe spaces, and where relationships were already frayed and violent patterns established, the incidences of this form of violence is increasing behind closed doors. Child abuse. The global escalation of violence against women is also seen in violence against children. Countries' statistics of requests for help and intervention are showing rates 2 to 3 times higher than before the pandemic. As this form of violence is often not reported at all, that is staggering when the person committing the violence is likely in the next room. In some cases, 40 to 70% increases in pleas for help, and these in developed countries with helplines and support networks. Despite the notion of protective isolation, children aren't safe during quarantine. They're moving targets for violence. Gendered inequality of labor. Women are getting crushed by the pandemic. As work moves into a domestic space already highly unequal and oppressive for women, the pandemic has exposed and exacerbated the gender fault line. Working from home may change the way we work, but it's also highlighting the challenge of who's doing it. As Nala Valfi from the UN has said, the formal economy is only possible because it's subsidized by women's unpaid work. All genders are suffering from the pandemic, but the social and economic burden of COVID-19 is far from universal. Women are already living in poverty more than men, earning less with less or no savings, and in precarious and low-paid work. The addition of both unpaid, invisible, and undervalued work that women do in the home hits single-parent households, extended female households, the households of refugees and internally displaced individuals even harder. Pandemics affect everyone, but after pandemics, men bounce back, and women and girls stay in shock. Lifting quarantines doesn't change this. It just makes it less visible, again. This gendering of work also relates to a critical aspect of the pandemic that needs further inspection. Women comprise the front line of essential workers, healthcare workers, cashiers, drugstore pharmacists, care aides, and the bulk of the disposable labor of the not profitable during the pandemic retail sector are also women. These jobs, like most jobs that women hold, are underpaid, unstable, unpredictable, and undervalued. The lifelines that keep the world together are lines held by women, women subsidizing the formal CRRIC economy all over the world. The pandemic won't alleviate this. After the front line comes home, there's elder care, childcare, healthcare, home-based education, hygiene and sustenance, and this is not isolated. Globally, women take on between 4 to 7 times more responsibilities at home than men. The motherhood penalty, pink tax, wage inequality, period poverty, structural violence, denial of adequate and timely health care, childcare burden, forced pregnancy, abuse, inadequate community support, and housework mean that women, especially the disabled, are not able to experience their full humanity, and the crisis won't change that. Which brings us to suicide, the leading cause of violent death in the world. How have suicide rates been impacted by the virus? 2 tales emerged so far. Despite increased financial stress, social isolation, limited community support, decreased physical and mental health care during the COVID-19 epidemic, in many places, the suicide rate has actually dropped, except for physicians, especially female physicians, who, like all doctors, face difficult work environments, the additional risk of burnout, moral and ethical harm, PTSD, and of course the virus itself. But female physicians are also relied on for the second shift, as we've seen, 4 to 7 times more than men. The point of this presentation is to ask ourselves, because I ask myself, what could surviving the COVID-19 global pandemic succeed in manifesting? Not just what form of new reality we collectively want, but what kind of life do we need to emerge from this pandemic in a more robust and resilient state? Because this isn't an ending, it's a beginning. But the beginning of what? And this is where the 4 domains of personal peacebuilding come in. The world feels out of control right now, and even in places that are meeting the crisis and managing, the reality is that not everyone has the same toolkit for facing conflict, and it can make you feel powerless, as if the past and future are blurring, and that we're stuck in a perpetual present, a crouch, waiting for the next catastrophe. This makes it hard for us to see cracks that let the light in, and difficult to feel like we're contributing personally. But here are 4 things I think any of us can do to build a better future. Personal peacebuilding is physiological. You're not your body, but it is your vehicle for life, and appropriate care, mindfulness, movement, and self-awareness are foundations for living. If you want to contribute to a changed world, start by changing yourself. Destructive behaviors, violent thoughts, biases, inhumanities, they can all change. We can learn to receive signals, to choose better, to foster wellness, check our privileges, and champion our accomplishments no matter how small. Don't forget yourself, protect yourself, fortify yourself. You cannot be there for others if you're not there for yourself. Personal peacebuilding is interpersonal. All of us have bubbles, and many of us have learned to erase, ignore, and outcast people who are different from us and hold different views. Do you want to embody full humanity? Treat others as fully human too. If your ability to encounter difference leads to indifference and dehumanization, you're part of the problem. Learn how to listen, how to care, how to unpack your own violence towards others, how to build and sustain relationships. It's possible. Personal peace building in the immanent transcendent biotic. We humans are a species comprised of matter and energy. Our connection to the self, to others, and the more than human world defines us. We're not islands. We can reconnect with spirit and nature around us, within us, and between us. You may worship while I wander. I may meditate while you pray. But all of us live on this planet, and her messages need to be listened to. Connection is food for your spirit, and none of us can heal if the earth is hurting. And finally, personal peace building is social. Community means shared fate, a people and a place, both a vessel of humanity and its contents. Being in community breeds obligation, love, and care. Social personal peace building is about understanding ourselves within community. If you want to be healthier, happier, and more resilient, build community. Be the pillars holding up the roof for others, and take shelter from the storms to come. You are not powerless. Anyone can contribute to a new and better world. And whoever's left standing, we need to be standing together. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Katerina. And I believe it's wonderful listening to her, how she drew from the impact of COVID and then to relating to personal peace building. Thank you. So our next panelist is Dr. Laura Reimer. Reimer, and floor is yours, ma'am. Unmute the mic, Laura. Yeah.
All the schooling in the world, you can't remember to unmute the mic. Anyways, I too want to acknowledge that we're on Treaty 1 land. I've been deeply involved in reconciliation work lately with Indigenous people here in Canada, and appreciating just on all new levels, again, what it means to share land and to share our ways of life together. I want to thank Cowser as well for putting this together. I am very thrilled to be here with my colleagues from the Morrow Institute. And yesterday I had an interesting experience which actually resulted in me completely changing what I was going to share today. So I'm talking about a specific organization. So in my presentation, we're going to go from the community or communitas level, past the personal and into one particular organization, and that is the university. My experience yesterday was that I was invited to a rural school division here in central Canada to talk about teaching Indigenous issues, and realized how long it's been since I sat at a table with 5 colleagues. We were social distanced. We all had a cup of coffee, which is a big part of, Canadian life. But I realized that it was early March last time I sat in the same room as a colleague, and hadn't realized that I am lonely, hadn't realized that we are all figuring this out. I believe I have been judgmental along the way of leaders. Anyways, it produced a number of thoughts in me. And so what I'm bringing to you today is my thoughts about the role of the university. As Dr. Ahmed mentioned, I wear different hats at my particular university, and have the privilege of serving as a Board of Governors member, as a program administrator in Canada's only Master of Human Rights program. I've been an instructor, and I absolutely love being in the classroom. And I'm also a union member. I'm also an alumni of the university. Came to the University of Manitoba when I was 19 and basically haven't left. I'd like to tell you it's been 20 years, but that'd be untrue. So, but I love university, and I love what it brings to our world. And so I'm going to share with you just some of my thoughts about that. Over the 800 years of the existence of the university, there are and continue to be competing opinions regarding its role. but ultimately, universities in any context, including COVID-19, operate to fulfill their purpose, like any organization does. Common literature tells us that universities exist to serve our future societies. They guard reason, inquiry, and philosophical openness. In other words, they're places for ideas, they're places for dreams and hopes, they're places for questions, and they're opportunities for us to discuss with some knowledge and curiosity matters that perhaps are discussed nowhere else. They're often a place for answers, and in COVID-19, we've seen the university embrace that role as well. Just as a bit of background, in Canada, universities are public institutions. That is, they're funded primarily by the public purse, which means by the taxes that we pay. This is significant. Each university has its own legislation, and therefore they are government guidelines for its operation. But although the universities in Canada are public, they also enjoy a unique relationship with government. There are times when it suits the universities to embrace the fact that they are distanced from government and from public opinion. And there are other times when universities respond to, are shaped by, and shape public opinion. The ongoing pandemic has surprised many of us, especially the longevity of the lockdown implementation. For those of us associated with higher education, and for many of us in different areas of educational leadership, both inside and outside the university setting, it has been a time that has required not just unprecedented leadership, flexibility, and accommodation, but also unprecedented followership. We have had to do what people have told us to do. Canadians are, I think, by nature, submissive, obedient people, and yet it has been difficult for us as well. On the university campus, from faculty, administration, employees, and students, whether or not the outcomes that have been made surrounding COVID-19 are positive or negative are yet to be measured. As I shared with you, I prepared quite a different presentation than what I'm sharing tonight. I'd originally presented something quite academic, but instead I'm going to talk, as I said, through my experience and through my observations. As I was completing what I was going to say tonight, for tonight, I was struck by the similar trends in our path with trends that are happening in other organizations. Also of note is the fact that while these challenges took place during the lockdowns, there are also challenges that will be part of pulling out of the lockdown. And I'm wondering, in some ways, what Dr. Mueller shared and what Dr. Katerina shared is that our challenge coming out of lockdown may even be greater than the challenges we faced going in and staying in that state. So my perspective on higher education, as I mentioned, has several prisms, at least 4, and I'm going to talk about the trends that have apparently risen to the top, in my view, through COVID-19. Without doubt, as we pull out of the global lockdown, a peaceful road into our shared future is what many of us are hoping for. The three trends that I've observed changing through the COVID-19 environment have been learning, employment, and weariness. The impacts on these areas have been significant to the university community, and they will also perhaps play a larger role as we come out of lockdown into a global community that is somewhat frightened, angry, and looking for a new future. I'm very interested to hear how listeners respond to my perceptions. I mentioned that I serve on the Board of Governors. I have watched in that capacity as leaders struggle to stay on top and to make really good decisions time after time after time. Initially, I felt impatient. Now I feel great admiration to know that there are great minds and people working hard to try to find common ground that will build a better future while we don't know what the future will look like. I've been teaching for 16 years in the university, but I've also taught always on a course-by-course capacity, and that's significant also to what I'm going to say later. Although I'm not authorized to speak on behalf of my university or on behalf of any of the other roles that I carry, I'm here to share my informed observations and some of my experiences of the impact of COVID-19 on the higher education landscape. It's relevant to know a little of our politics. Canada is a federal system, meaning that our central or federal government has some constitutional responsibilities, but our second level, which we call our provincial governments, have different constitutional responsibilities. So one is not the boss of the other. This is significant because in Canada, education is the responsibility of the provinces. So COVID-19 decisions by our federal government have had an impact on education, regardless of whether or not those areas are specifically under the purview of the federal government. In this way, the university can be arm's length from government in terms of decision-making, research, and practice. But since government is also our major funder, we're also subject to provincial budget restrictions. These have been mandatory to pay for our health care through COVID-19 because health care in Canada is also a provincial responsibility. The university has been asked to restrict spending because public dollars, our national currency, are required to keep our health system strong. It's an important piece of our COVID-19 higher education story. It is a difficult part of our piece. On March 20th of this year, our university demonstrated decisive and insightful leadership. The President's office announced that the following Monday and Tuesday, the university would be shut down and all classes canceled, so that on Wednesday, it would open again with all classes online. I do believe at that time that our university leadership, and maybe all of us, thought it would be a short lockdown. Instead, the university has been in complete lockdown with buildings closed up. And although exams were completed, courses completed, and summer enrollment is up, day-to-day life at the university has changed for all of us in all of our capacities. The university basically has three roles, and everything in the structure of the university is there to support these roles: research, teaching, and service. In many ways, the research role hasn't changed, and although we're not traveling for on-site data collection, research continues in other forms. And although service hasn't really changed, and this webinar is an example of a different form of service that has actually been enabled by COVID-19. So as experts, we're called on various ways to contribute to society, and in a lot of ways that hasn't changed. What is different is the teaching. And I think that for the university, this is one of the big questions that has to be asked. What do we need, and what do we talk about when we talk about teaching? Obviously, we're thinking also about learning. It's an area for potential debate. Although enrollment is up apparently in most post-secondary institutions, and ours is no exception, teaching is now primarily online. If the purpose of the university is in part to teach, then it really doesn't matter if classes are delivered online or live. We've heard many university administrations repeat that their schools continue to provide robust academic offerings to students. But there's much more to learning than just teaching or just delivering information. The role of the university in society is much more than just imparting knowledge. It's being together, and educational research across cultures has told us that learning takes place best when we are together, in small groups or even as individuals. A talking head on a computer screen may be technically made pass for teaching, but there are very large gaps in the learning end. I've heard professors talk of being exhausted after their online classes, the same classes after which they usually feel exhilarated after live interaction. Students too talk of the challenge of the discipline of online learning. Again, if the role of the university is just imparting knowledge, then online is fine. But we do much more than that. So this is not to discount that there are effective and proven online pedagogies, but profs and instructors will have to learn what these are and how to use them if the goal of the academy is learning more than just teaching. Having said this, another opportunity from COVID-19 emerges. We've had 3 months to pause and reconsider how learning is delivered in the university. Here in Canada, we are bound in many ways by different agreements, but those should not in any way hinder the discovery of better ways to ensure learning. Significantly, there is a wide research-based literature about effective teaching and learning, including online learning. So although there are predictions of a 25 to 30% drop in enrollments for the next academic year, there's also an opportunity for university to reconsider online offerings. Can enrollment and financial losses be recovered through creative but research-based online offerings to be presented alongside in-person experiences? So one of the big impacts of COVID-19 on the university has been the removal of face-to-face interactions between students and instructors, between students and each other, instructors and one another. But it's also allowed us to pause and reflect on what it is we're trying to truly accomplish in a university classroom. This is, if you think about it, the first time in 800 years that we can actually stop and think about how we deliver courses and think about whether or not we can do it differently to truly build a better future. This is exciting. A second very real impact and trend I've seen in COVID-19 on the university has been its threat to employment. As a non-tenured professor and as a program administrator, I face a precarious future. But at the same time, many of the most vulnerable and lowest paid members of the university community face likely employment due to a number of factors. I believe that we have known for decades, perhaps centuries, that few academics are also administrators, managers, or enjoy the so-called paperwork part of leadership in the university organization. Does this mean that perhaps we have an opportunity to think carefully about the structure of universities, to have people who are really good at that kind of thing step into leadership roles and in that way save a number of jobs by just repurposing them? As academics, we're used to asking questions and looking for answers. So is it time to rethink how the university is administered and perhaps consider more secure positions for everyone, regardless of whether or not they've got job security? Perhaps we have an opportunity to think about the role of the university and how each function fits into the ultimate role and contribution of the schools. When we were in the earlier stages of COVID-19 and the financial costs of the public healthcare system were escalating, I expected to see radical, wide-sweeping changes to the administrative structure of the university. But it seems that for the most part, it's been business as usual, and we've been able to fund it. So we're fortunate here in Canada that the costs of COVID-19 on our public purse have not really impacted us in any meaningful structural ways at the university. And I want to stress that Dr. Standish pointed out the other ways that COVID-19 has impacted communities, but at the university level, we really aren't seeing that. The daily announcements of billions of available currencies from our national leader seems to have had the net effect of fear. And in a federal system like Canada, there's a trickle-down effect in the end, and we will all pay for that spending through our taxes. How that will affect the university is yet to be seen, but we are likely to see more unemployment as we go through managerial choices to downsize. Again, however, this is perhaps an opportunity. Faced with wide-scale unemployment and job insecurity, maybe it's time to rethink. Again, we are a place of ideas. The third point, and I'll conclude quite quickly, is weariness. I believe that leadership is weary, not just in the university, but around the world. Our leaders have been fighting the fight for a very long time, and there's no sign of a peaceful world on the other side. We will have to structure that. I wonder if this is what it's like to live during periods of war. The constant stress wears us out, makes us afraid. And above all, COVID-19 has made us weary. That may be the greatest impact of the pandemic on the university. Our leadership talks about how much change they're coping with a constant fluid foundation on which they stand. But in fact, I think maybe we need to hear what they're saying. At all levels of our global community, people have been leading to the best of their abilities. Whether it's just their own life or whether it's a large organization, we are all working hard to find a way forward. I want and need to hear hope, but the truth is, our leaders have been waging a terrible battle for a long time. For some leaders, there's also been battles in the media, battles in their own constituency, and in a much broader theater than what appears in their job description. I think we need to see that leaders are weary. And this is coupled with bored, restless, and angry followers. We've lost the communities that we were part of before the world went into lockdown. And that loss, coupled with the weariness of those who tried so hard to lead through all of this, has made us all vulnerable to things that don't build peace, that could produce terrible conflict, but also have opportunity to move us forward. We have weary leaders, we have angry followers. Some ways this is scary to me, and it leads me to my final point. Coming out of lockdown will be in many ways harder, I think, than it was to go in or to manage the lockdown. For higher education, we may see some changes in teaching and some fluctuating in how meetings are conducted. But mostly, what we're witnessing globally are members of our constituency. And our challenge will be to harness the energy and the anger and the hope, the desire for something new, and perhaps shape that into enrollment and into something good and productive for a better future for all of us. I recognize that not everybody can go to university, and I don't want to pretend that everybody can, but it is an opportunity for us again to bring in new ideas, to bring new voices to the table, and to rethink how tomorrow can be. So the role of the university to build a better society and a shared future hasn't changed. And given the sheer number of smart people that attend, work in, and lead our universities, I dare to be hopeful. And so my 4 perspectives on COVID-19 and higher education have resulted in the recognition of 3 trends: learning, employment, and weary leadership. But each of these are actually potential avenues for new dreams to be dreamed in and beyond the university. And I conclude by stating that despite my earlier concerns and fears in our volatile world, each of these trends do contain hope in the university setting, where new ideas are explored, expanded, and practiced. And I hold as testimony to you the words of my esteemed colleagues tonight, who are full of ideas, expanding ideas, and hope for our broader tomorrow. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Laura, for fascinating, couple of points that you brought up today. And definitely, we are expecting our audiences to put up their questions. So our today's last panelist, Dr. Evelyn Mayanja, and she's going to talk on peace and my COVID-19 neighbor. And Dr. Mayanja, floor is yours. You can unmute the mic, please. Yeah. So just kindly unmute the mic in the bottom of the screen.
Okay, thank you.
Good.
Good to see you all after a very long time. And thank you, Dr. Ahmed, for organizing this. It is a very interesting topic, but very, very complex. And as I looked at it, I was asking myself, really, when we talk about peace building, higher education, conflicts, what do we mean? And all this time since we closed the universities, as Laura was mentioning, I've been struggling with defining COVID. And yesterday, as I strolled around, I decided to define it as whatever is taking away our breath. And this is what we see happening in systems all around us. There's that struggle for breath. There's struggle for newness, for new air. The question that I was asking myself is, how do we come to that? Because even when we are in conflicts, when peace building does not enable people to breathe, war erupts again. I was even asking myself, how are universities helping learners to breathe? Unfortunately, sometimes they take away breath instead of giving it to people. I will explain this. What do I mean by all this? And then I was also wondering that probably before we look at the impacts, we need to examine what is causing all this. And so I decided to look at 3 main causes before we could go into what impacts. Of course, we know that peace building is a process, higher education is a process, conflict resolution is also a process. And actually, going back to the definition that I've given for COVID-19, all of this, indirectly, we are trying to give back life. But then how do we recover life? More or less like the question that you have all raised. How do we come out of this struggle? How do we transform this crisis of COVID-19 to ensure that we come up with something new, a new world order, a new approach to education, a new administration and leadership in education, in education systems and institutions, and also in the community? Because community, liminality, binarity, they all go with being together. But something new, I think, is what we are looking for now. The theoretical framework that I decided to take is really that capacity to listen very attentively to what is going on around us. I wouldn't, given the limited time, I will not go into the definition of this theory of listening, but it's very, very important because it is only in listening that we come to discover what we must do. So then the question I posed that when all this is going on, who is my neighbor? I always like to tease our minds with questions. Really, if we look around, who is my COVID neighbor? We are in all this together, but who is my close neighbor? Especially where we have tried so much to isolate ourselves on either classism or all other isms that we have created as a human society. You find them stronger in some communities than others. I will not answer that question for anyone. Who is my neighbor? I think it is something that we need to think about more seriously. But the definition that I want to give, first of all, is I think my first neighbor is myself. Because sometimes when we are so busy, we don't pay attention to the first neighbor, me. And when I say me, it's not just Evelyn walking on the streets. No, my inner being, which many times fails to breathe because of stress, because of too much work. And when I fail to breathe, when that self is not taken care of, I cannot really contribute to creating a better learning environment, to creating peace, and to resolving conflicts. And many times you find that as academics, busy schedules, deadlines, they prevent us to take that deep breath. And so you find that we live in a discrete, I would say, our life becomes divided. The mind and the heart are not in sync. Sometimes I move around and you find that people are walking, but they can easily knock you. It's like their minds are there, the body is moving, but the heart is not there. They don't even recognize you. They don't recognize the person who is close to them. But then, even when you look at our education systems, we have fallen into the trap of educating minds, but not the heart. And so you find that we have so many intelligent people, but they are the one who's looting our resources, robbing our banks. And today we see the crisis of leadership because you cannot lead without the heart. And unfortunately, even when we talk about peace building as a process, at least the liberal peace focuses on systems and not people. I've never read any definition talking about peace building as care for human beings and their hearts and their well-being. But whatever makes us human goes beyond physical features. It is really the heart of who I am. And we cannot give anything to others without first being. Being is better than doing. Or it first, at least doing should be preceded by being. So the heart has to control the mind. Others would look at it differently, that the mind has to control the heart. For me, I think they have to go together. Because if we make decisions without the heart, we end up in trouble. And that's what we see many times driving so many conflicts that we have around. The second neighbor that I look at is the people around us. Today we are in a crisis that because of the classes, the isms that we have created, really we don't know the people who are close to us. Sometimes we don't know even the students we teach. Sometimes we don't know even as professors, instructors, we don't know each other because we are there for a business, which takes away our breath, unfortunately. But then I look at COVID also as an opportunity that, while, as Laura mentioned, probably it is an event, a situation, and an opportunity to come together, of course, through the internet, yes, but maybe also to come together more and more as people, but also with oneself. Because when we stay home, there's more time to think and reflect than when we are always on the road. But then when we look at people, again, who are my neighbors, for me, I see a lot of pain, a lot of hearts in people's heart, in people around us. We have watched people being slaughtered. The case of Freud is one, but there are so many others. In all the landscapes of war and the violence that we have visited, or where we have done our research, we have watched people being enslaved. I was reading the history of the United States. We hardly think about slavery and how it has led to all the events that we are living today. I was imagine putting a chain around someone's neck. Today, even dogs, we don't put chains around them. But yeah, we have chains around people's bodies. We have watched people's identities and cultures destroyed. We have watched systems and policies that continue to enslave and dehumanize people. But we have also adapted the languages and the codes that even in the academia we don't dare to challenge. People of color, who is colorless? Minorities, majorities. Who are the minorities today in our societies? Who are maybe yesterday's majority are going to become tomorrow's minorities. If today we have mistreated them, how are they going to treat us? And of course, as we know, Foucault says this, that language is power. Those who formulate all these codes, they know, because it is a form of control, a form of dehumanization, taking away people's well-being. These are the codes that we use to ensure that some are employed, others are not employed. Some are left out, others are included. And this is leading to so many disparities in our societies. Economic inequality, gender, name it. Everything boils down to all this inclusion and exclusion. And many times you find that this language goes with physical, mental, psychological, economic violences or structural violence. The third neighbor that we have neglected for a long time is nature. I was looking at before COVID, how the whole world was so suffocated. I was watching some videos from Beijing, even in New York. Time was coming when we could not breathe because of pollution. I never imagined that thousands and thousands of airplanes would be grounded, that ships cannot move. Could this be a way that nature is purifying itself? Because we have neglected it. We have not considered it as our neighbor. And I think because of capitalism, because capitalism is always to extract, greedily extracting without replacement. But unfortunately, even for us peace builders, we are easily consumed and taken away by that capitalist mentality of consuming without paying attention to nature. So I think COVID is a moment of reflection to see how we relate with all these neighbors, the three: self, people, and nature. And I think if we transform and integrate these relationships, will be able to curb conflicts at so many levels, will be able to become more effective peace builders wherever we are. But also, if we ensure that the education that we impart embraces these three levels, probably through our universities, we'll be able to transform societies. What do we do? How do we get to all this? Especially in an environment of everything being looked at in terms of business. Even in COVID, as someone mentioned, for many, they are earning billions out of this, while others are impoverished. I will allow me to suggest the way forward to all this. Really, I feel that it is high time we focus on educating hearts. That even if we are teaching online, to ensure that we impart that knowledge that will enable people to go deep into themselves and not just filling the brains. Because we have intelligent people who are just robbing our banks, who are taking the resources that would have benefited the common good. Because we have given them intelligence, but we have not trained them to become better human beings. The second element that I want to suggest is to allow our comfort, our privileges to be disturbed by the neighbor who is being dehumanized. And also sometimes it helps to walk in the shoes of others. That's why I said, who are my neighbors? Do I know them? Because I think if we walk in their shoes, we'll be able to understand who they are. But that disturbs our comfort, our privileges. And that's why I think as society, there's a lot of competition. Because if others allow something that they will benefit, they will get the best share. Where I come from, as Dr. Mueller was saying, as a community, if we share, we all become strong. Greed and the competition does not help us. But that requires disturbing and interrupting our comfort and happiness sometimes. It requires giving oneself. And also, I suggest the third element of really demanding different levels of society, that we pay attention to the rights and dignity of those whose rights and dignity have been trampled upon for so long. We are here in Canada. For how long have we been talking about the rights of the Indigenous people? But where is their dignity, their well-being? We continue to see them loitering our streets and we walk away. But also to have the courage to look at those who are different, those whom we call minorities, people of color, their fathers, their mothers, their sisters, their friends, they are human beings. But institutions, power has dehumanized them. And also I think it is high time, especially in peace studies, that we devise systems of healing people. Many people are hurting, that they will not even understand about our jargons of peace building, peacekeeping. It doesn't make sense when people are hurting. You are not addressing my need. You are just imparting your scholarship. They are not interested in that. I'm afraid that sometimes if we don't really bend very low to where people are, soon we are going to become obsolete. And finally, finding ways of speaking truth to power. They have to hear us. They have to hear people's struggles and people's tears and people's cries. If we do this, I believe that we'll be able to reimagine a new society, a new world order, a new me, a new you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Evelyn, for this insightful piece. So this discussion, first part is hereby concluded here. And now we move on to the question and answer sessions. And we have received a number of questions from our audience by now. And just to be conscious of time and Dr. Katerina's next appointment before she goes out. So we would like to flash the question quickly. And before I go on to the questions, let me just allow our audience to have a summary of our panelists' talk. So Dr. Mueller told us about fluid time, how identities are affected, liminality, and how to establish connections, and how it is actually affecting our time in the post and current COVID-19, time frame. Dr. Katerina especially spoke about personal peace building, and she also gave us quite a, I would say, very important landscape of COVID-19 that is very important to remember. And she also mentioned about liquid modern state of an increasing inequality. Dr. Laura spoke about the whole impact of COVID-19 into our higher education, and she mentioned three important pieces: research and policy. And she wonderfully spoke about 800 years of our this current system of education, and we have never paused to think. And I think this is a fantastic idea, and we can listen more from her. And finally, Dr. Evelyn spoke about neighbor and who should be the primary neighbor that we should always remember about COVID-19. And listening, education of hearts, these are very, very important. And finally, she concluded by saying that truth to power, this is, we are yet to see how it happens in the post-COVID-19 world. So I will also combine a couple of questions for one panelist. Here we have one question from Mr. Orko Ahmed, and it is to Dr. Katerina, and you can see the question, and you are free to respond.
Sorry, just reading the question right now. So the question, what challenges lie ahead for sustainable peace building once the second and third waves of COVID hit? I don't think that the challenge changes. I think the response changes. I think that what we're going to find is that things that worked well the first lockdown will probably be redeployed, and things that didn't will likely be altered. The other part of this idea of response, the idea of what challenges lie ahead, it relates to who's left standing, because the reality is that this pandemic isn't just altering the landscape of who's there, but who can be there. Because as you know, Dr. Reimer already indicated, there's a fluidity in employment. And so the idea of how do you work towards sustainable peace building in a milieu where the people at the table keep changing. So that's going to be a challenge, because the people who were there for the first lockdown aren't going to necessarily be the same people who are there for the second or the third. I personally am an optimist, and I doubt we'll go for another 6 or 7 months without a vaccine somewhere. So the idea of second and third waves that will then, wipe out large swathes of the planet, I actually don't think that's necessarily going to happen. I think second and third waves are things that are happening in localities. And I do think that the idea of instability is what needs to also be highlighted here, is that COVID has highlighted existing inequalities and highlighted existing instabilities. And that, in a way, is an opportunity. So the challenges that lie ahead, the things that we were talking about in the first lockdown, will not be the things that we're talking about in the second. And I think that the question says third, although I do think that we'll probably have, at least for this pandemic, a response that's valid. And I'll just make one more comment on that as well, is that the COVID-19 global pandemic is being experienced in different ways globally, all over the world. What it is permitting is, in some instances, a rapid response. In some instances, a full court press on what is happening. And as Laura talked about, this idea of collaboration and in a way also obedience. Do what you're told, go here, do that, etc., because the greater good is what's at stake here. Now, if we can do that because of a virus, why can't we do that for child poverty? Why can't we do that for any other form of social ill or any other form of social, cultural, and territorial threat. If we can respond so quickly to something epidemiological, why is that will not also there for things that we've been identifying for decades as part of the problem? I'm sorry, I didn't see the second part of the question before it was removed, but my sense is that the COVID, oh, thank you. So, and if the Black Lives Matters movement persists for months on end, intensifying every month, maybe in a way that relates to the first part. This is a response to something that is not good enough. And the not good enough needs to get better. And so if we've been able to respond, and I think that we're seeing the Black Lives Matters protests, riots, and the instability that's happening in the United States, what we're also seeing there is a great deal of response, and it will not be enough, and it is not at all what needs to happen in terms of overturning white supremacy and understanding how the world that we live in, at least the world that we live in the West, has got winners and losers, and the losers never had a chance. And that includes Indigenous peoples, that includes women, that includes people of disabled communities. There's a lot of people who did not have the same advantages. And so, yes, understanding how to feel discomfort, as Evelyn said, the idea that things are going to have to get a little rockier for people that have had it better in order for everybody to get elevated. So I think actually it's an opportunity. I think that the idea that we aren't breathing and that none of us could have imagined 3 months ago, no planes flying and the birds returning and all this, strange circumstances in terms of nature, it is an opportunity. But what it shows to me is that with will, a lot is possible.
Thank you very much. And now we have this second question, and this is to Dr. Adam Mueller, I believe, because he spoke about concept of communitas.
So I can be heard now, right? So, I mean, the question really is with regard to communitas, and that actually dovetails with a couple of the other things that have been said already. And actually, let me just say, backing up a little bit, that I was very, very pleased to notice so many intersections between what everybody was saying. I think there's no deep disagreement here about really anything. I think the devil's in the details, of course, and we may choose to privilege certain kinds of questions over other questions. But in general, I think we're sort of mapping the problem in roughly the same sorts of ways, being attendant to how the virus and the lockdown resulting from it have offered us both at one and the same time opportunities for real transformation, and then obviously risks and potential harms having to do with what persists in the current moment from the injustices that preceded it, right? So and that's all. I mean, I heard this, I was very fascinated by it, in fact, because we didn't obviously discuss what we were going to do in any deep way before this. So it's interesting that we're coming out in the same place. I wanted to say something briefly about communitas, and I want to contrast it again. I'm just sort of opting for that Turner-esque kind of reading of these terms, so that what we used to have was community, and community was anchored in two things. It was anchored in place and in something like, not face-to-faceness, because we get that with the digital domain, but we do get physical presence. So the metaphysics of presence sort of anchors and grounds community in ways that is localizable territorially, right? Like that's the sort of traditional classical kind of understanding. And then we say, okay, well, there's overlap in values because people are compressed in a particular place and what have you. Communitas is different, and it's whatever is enabled in a moment where that former order starts to break down. And when it starts to break down, people no longer have expectations of the kinds of roles that they're being assigned. They have no longer scripts to follow insofar as their moral duties are concerned, partly because the moral framework itself is one of the casualties of the liminal moment. And remember, too, that what we take to be the moral oftentimes is just a kind of majoritarian impulse. It's not something that's argued for in some universally kind of disinterested way, unless that universalism is asserted at the expense of acknowledging the particularism underneath it, right? Like oftentimes we know that universalism is just a masquerade of the particular. So we have this kind of moral framework. We have this expectations, what Gadamer calls horizons of significance. We have that entering into this liminal moment. Liminal moment's thrust upon us. We sort of react in a hodgepodge, sort of confused way at first, and then we realize what we've produced is a world filled with gaps. And then there's this amazing kind of challenge, which is hard on one hand. You know, we have to fill the gaps in so that we can have a contiguous life, a coherent life. And on the other hand, we don't know how to fill it in, so we're confused and we try things. Some of them work, some of them don't. But here's the thing, if all of this is taking place non-physically, or not, a substantial part of this is taking place non-physically, then it's taking place with people all over the world who are informing the redefinition and redescription of what we're doing. Plus, they're sending us information about their experiences that we can then integrate into our own sense of what's going on in the world. And all of this yields a prevailing kind of horizontality that potentially, at least, can motivate deep structural change. And I think that's the demand of something like Black Lives Matter, right? Like deep structural change. Although I'm a little, I mean, it's early days in some sense, yeah, and also not in another sense. But I guess I'm a little concerned with BLM that there's all this talk about structural violence and structural racism and very little identification of the many structures complicit in buttressing the racial project as it exists, not just in America. And frankly, there is an American way of race. There is an Americanistic kind of discourse and identity that is risking a kind of globalization. And through that globalization, a series of distortions and misrepresentations as it gets projected into a world where other contexts mean race functions differently. Blackness is just a different thing in Congo than it is in New York, right? And so that's not to say that it's radically different or radically separate. I'm just saying that right now, what we're presented with is the challenge of suturing together again this post-virus world. And there's so many unanswered questions and so little of the kind of granularity that I was grateful for Katerina, Laura, and Evelyn for introducing to us today, that I think we're at a moment where communitas has given us the opportunity to remake communities. Communities will only be remade when they accrete, when they start getting bounded and defined. We shouldn't rush that process, even if delaying that accretion comes with significant costs for some of the most vulnerable amongst us. Partly, we need to do more work to figure out who's vulnerable, how they're vulnerable, and how to address their risks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mueller. Next question is posed to Dr. Reimer, and here it is.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kauser. I'm really happy to see this sentence and this question, because this is a very popular misconception. Frankly, Orko, this is not correct. This was the 10%, 20%, and 30% reductions were a request for scenarios if the province was facing unprecedented healthcare costs. It was never an order. It's public administration. It's not politics. And that's a very important distinction. So what the province asked for was what the university would look like with a 10% reduction in salaries, a 20% reduction, and a 30% reduction. Our university did not provide any of those. In the end, you've mentioned the bursaries that are now available. My understanding of public administration, I have a master's degree in it and taught it for a long time. There are different budgets. And so this is a reorganizing of budgets. Our university doesn't have details yet, but we have complied with the 1% that we were asked to produce and the 4%. And those decisions were made for the most part at the levels where they were going to have the effect. So it wasn't a heavy-handed top-down decision. I saw the letters from the minister, but certainly your understanding that it was an order that was rescinded is a common misunderstanding. And I could go on about the media, but I won't. So I hope that answers your question. I think there was a second part, was there? Oh, will the government be standing in the way of sharing? Oh no, about further weakening the economy. There's no evidence of a weakening economy in Manitoba. Again, speaking of a federal system, our real threat economically is coming from the federal spending of multiple billions of dollars, unaccounted for, that will have to be paid for through tax dollars. And that means you and I will pay federal taxes and our children on it. So I hope that clarifies it for you. We have actually led the country in Manitoba in terms of the pandemic. And so I think that I participated in a live consultation last night and listened to my fellow citizens talk about what it's been like to experience. And again, we are obedient people here in Manitoba. And so I think because we've responded the way that we have as individuals, we have saved each other's lives. And so I hope that helps, Orko. Again, these are public administration matters, not politics. And but thank you for asking the question. I hope that clarifies it.
Can I just add something briefly, just to supplement what you said,
Right.
Laura? Just because I run the department, and we're expecting between 3 to 5% cut in our budget this year. So really, and it's partly a function of longstanding commitments to cut plus whatever the government required now, but we're nowhere near. We were told, I think 10, 20, 30, and we came in at around 3 to 5%. So a lot of us are just feeling kind of relieved about this. But I tell you something, the people, and I know that because I've just last week got a request from a friend of mine in the international office who's being laid off along with 5 of his colleagues. It's the support staff and the service staff who are getting nailed with this. And if budgets shrink, it's going to be contract teachers who do not get their contracts renewed, who do not get opportunities to be in the classroom. So there's an important way in which, notwithstanding how the cuts are made, they're not going to be experienced all the way down the same way. And we professors with tenure are just not going to feel the pain. Okay, my salary won't go up next year, but that's it. But other people are.
And I mentioned that in my presentation, that it is the most vulnerable members of the university community that are carrying the financial impacts of COVID-19, without doubt. Yeah.
Thank you for participating and clarifying the questions. Dr. Evelyn, I have a question for you, if you kindly accept. I was listening very intently the way you presented the environment of COVID-19 and how it is impacting our thought process as an educator. So the question is, do you think COVID-19 would at least let us think about redesigning of pedagogy and at the level of higher studies education? And do you see any major change in that pedagogy? And when I refer to pedagogy, I mean a very deep sense of changing the mode of delivery of the content that we usually teach to students.
Yeah, I think as Laura mentioned, really it should change everything. But from where I stand, that change must come from listening. For example, as far as PACS is concerned, I think interrogating the views of the students would be very, very important, but also sessional instructors, because students tell us a lot, maybe more than what maybe they can confide to tenure professors. So I think it has to be a process that listening will lead to policy change. And of course, I feel that as far as peace studies are concerned, really we need to have our ears on the ground 24/7. But unfortunately, sometimes we just get lost in books and the theories which have been written, and really we fail to address the issue because conventionality keeps progressing almost on a daily basis. To the extent that sometimes I argue that as far as peace studies are concerned, the best books are in the field, not what we find in the library.
So thank you very much, Dr. Evelyn, for your answer. So we are at the last stage of our today's session, and we have an observer with us. And let me see if she's still there. I hope she's not. Uh, just to wrap up our today's webinar, first off, my sincere gratitude from Conflict and Resilience Research Institute. It's a very small effort from a couple of us here in Winnipeg to research on conflict and peace building. And I'm really grateful to my, where I was trained, and that is Mueller Institute for Peace and Justice. And most of us today, you have seen audience are a product of that fantastic institution which has come up as lead institution in Canada. So before I leave the session and say goodbye to all, let's hear the last words from the panelists. And I would invite Dr. Mueller to start his last words, followed by Dr. Reimer, and finally Dr. Evelyn.
So again, thank you. Thanks to everybody who's participated in this, for the questions, Kaz in particular, for sort of synthesizing everything and pulling it together. It's difficult to think of last words or anything that's sort of summary and final in the wake of an argument about liminality and determinacy and open-endedness. I think there's something sort of disingenuous about pretending that this is tidier or easier than it's going to be. I mean, one of the important things that I've heard from everybody today, and I certainly believe myself, is that there's no way through this crisis involving the university or life generally that's going to be straightforward and easy. It has to do with contingencies, but I think it also has to do with vulnerabilities, insecurities, hatreds, and inertia, frankly. And if there's a sort of silver lining here, and a number of us have suggested there might be, it has to do with just the not business as usual character of the moment we're in, and how it's thrown us back on ourselves to do work of personally transformative kind of peace building, to do work of transcendent sorts of peace building, to use some of Katerina's categories, which I liked very, very well, to refresh and restore our relationship to nature, actually, and to the local, even as we accept that maybe our community is something that's no longer localizable in the sense that it used to be. So I think, what we've got here is, I think in this discussion too, if you're taking notes, if you're keeping track, you have a very good list of things to watch out for. And this list constitutes a series of challenges that any peace builder has to face, whether it's at this moment in this milieu or elsewhere. I mean, I think these are fundamental problems in the work that we do or try to encourage others to do. And to that extent, I wish everybody well with it. I think it's the struggle we need to be engaged in, regardless of whether or not we view it as something likely in the short term to yield success. And we have two choices, right? We can accept the status quo, or we can change it. We know what the status quo is. We know we have reasons to not want it. So let's just do what we can to perform a kind of futurity that we actually would feel comfortable inhabiting. And to the extent that we're willing to do that, and we can encourage everybody to do that, I think we're probably doing our jobs.
Thank you very much. Dr. Reimer.
I did the mic. Jeepers. That was very good on your feet there, Adam. I'm scrambling still to come up with concluding comments. I think that what I like Katerina, I'm an optimist, and you guys know me, and I do see, I see silver linings, but I also see problems very easily, so I'm not foolish about it. But where I do see hope is that we need each other, and we are in the people business, right? And so I hope that we will have much better structures, that we are, as Adam pointed out, cognizant of the pains that we have caused and continue to cause. I think we're in a growing community of people who are really committed to doing no harm. And we've had an opportunity, as I said, to pause and rethink how we do things, not just at a large organizational level, but also at a personal level. And as Adam pointed out, there'll be many people that suffer, and we can also share, as Evelyn said, we can share our hearts with people and in practical ways, you know, whether that's meals or finances or just some kind of a contact, but the way forward will be built by all of us together. And in many, many ways, that's a very exciting concept. In all of history, we have never done this, just stopped and said, what needs to stop and never return, and what can that, you know, we're not going back to what it was. And so I cling to that hope, acknowledging that there is still lots of ugly around us. And thank you again for organizing this, and for all of you for making the time to be here.
Thank you, Laura. Dr. Evelyn.
Yeah, thank you, Kauza, first of all, for organizing this. And to all my co-presenters, it is always a joy to see you. In Africa, we have a proverb that if you walk alone, you can go far, but you have a lonely journey. Whereas if you walk together, you may cover a short distance, but you have an interesting, and you learn a lot along the way. So I think even as we face all these challenges, I think we can do a lot together than taking lonely journeys. And this will require consultations and listening, as I mentioned before. But I think when the going is tough also, I think it is important to remember that really, even being together with the same passion is already a strong source of hope. And I also wish to acknowledge that I feel sometimes that nature is the one inviting us really to go on our knees. Nobody foresaw this COVID. And we are all struggling. We cannot, but nature knows the way. So probably we need more and more to listen to what nature tells us. And again, at home, we have a proverb that if we don't pay attention to nature, it will always take away the predator. So I think if we don't listen to nature, it is eliminating us. Maybe this virus is one, but others more will come. Remember, there were predictions of dark weeks and whatever, and we will not be able to breathe. When Greta Thunberg was going around, nobody ever imagined that really this whole world could come to a standstill. For me, that shows us the power of nature, and I think we can learn a lot from what nature teaches us on a daily basis. And finally, thank you again. And yeah, going back to my topic, let's listen to each other, my neighbor. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Evelyn. Ladies and gentlemen, that finally concludes our today's webinar session. On behalf of Conflict and Resilience Research Institute, once again, my heartfelt thanks and gratitude to the wonderful and esteemed panelists. And I think we have quite a number of listeners, those who tuned in today, and your insights will remain present in the web, and people would be able to listen to you, what you say today. And I'm sure people would take due care of your insights and your experiences. And before you leave, Conflict and Resilience Research Institute is going to have another webinar on 21st on Rohingya crisis, and followed by 26th June. That is going to be very interesting because we are going to talk on Black Lives Movement and race relations in North America, special focus on Canada, and we'll be joined by ex-police chief Devon Clunies of Winnipeg, and some of our community members from minorities and indigenous population. So I would be once again requesting your presence and your time, if you can, and I will be definitely updating our main website posters to allow you to have enough time to tune in. And once again, thank you very much for your support for today's webinar. Stay well, stay safe, and just to conclude with one sentence I've taken from this webinar is we are all in this together, and together we'll come out as resilient. Thank you very much once again. Good night.
Thank you.